She woke up again at 3 a.m., her chest tight with an unnamed ache that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. Everything in her life was perfectly arranged, career ascending like clockwork, relationships functioning without drama, health markers all within normal ranges. Yet something inside felt like it was slowly dying, withering away in the spaces between her perfectly scheduled days. The body was screaming what the spirit had whispered for years, but she had learned to interpret these midnight awakenings as stress, these chest tightenings as anxiety, these waves of inexplicable sadness as symptoms to be managed rather than messages to be decoded. There exists a particular kind of suffering that has no medical name, no therapeutic category, no pharmaceutical solution. It's the pain of a soul in exile from itself, the ache of living a life that fits but doesn't fulfill, the chronic homesickness for a self you've never fully met. You feel it in the hollow spaces between your ribs, in the way mornings arrive empty despite your calendar being full, in how success tastes like ash in your mouth, even as others celebrate your achievements. This isn't depression, though it often masquerades as one, wearing the same grey cloak of listlessness. This isn't anxiety, though it shares the same restless pulse, the same sense that something is fundamentally wrong. This is what happens when your spiritual calling knocks persistently on the door of your consciousness, and you keep pretending no one's home, turning up the volume on your daily life to drown out the sound of that gentle but insistent knocking. The ancient mystics knew something we've systematically forgotten in our rush toward productivity and optimization. Recurring emotional symptoms are often soul messages written in the only language the ego can't ignore: pain. When we refuse to listen to the whispers of our deeper nature, when we dismiss the subtle tugs toward something more authentic, the soul begins to speak in symptoms, in midnight panic attacks that seem to come from nowhere, in the chronic feeling that we're living someone else's life, in the persistent sense that we're meant for something we can't yet name. Carl Jung wrote extensively about what he called the creative illness, a necessary disintegration that precedes integration, a purposeful breaking apart that allows something truer to emerge. He observed that many of his patients weren't suffering from mental illness in the traditional sense, but from what he termed the general neurosis of our age, the soul sickness that comes from living too far from our authentic nature. Tonight, we're going to decode that ancient language of pain. We're going to explore why your suffering might not be something to fix, but something to listen to with the reverence we would bring to a sacred text. Because what if the very thing you've been trying to heal is actually trying to heal you? What if your pain is not evidence of your brokenness, but proof of your soul's refusal to settle for a life that looks right, but feels wrong? The Sufi poet Rumi understood this when he wrote about being broken open by love, about how the crack in everything is where the light gets in. But we've forgotten how to see our emotional fractures as potential doorways, our persistent dissatisfactions as invitations to something deeper, our restless hearts as compass needles pointing toward our true north. This exploration requires courage, not the kind of courage that charges into battle, but the quiet courage that sits still long enough to hear what the silence is trying to say. It's the courage to consider that your pain might be intelligent, that your symptoms might be symbolic, that your suffering might be sacred. Forget everything you've heard about finding your purpose, about discovering your passion, about identifying your unique gifts to offer the world. A true spiritual calling isn't a career counseling session with the universe. It's not a mission statement or a 5-year plan or a perfectly articulated vision board. It's something far more primal, far more disruptive, far more demanding than that. A spiritual calling is an invitation to let something die, so something truer can be born. It's the universe asking you to release the person you thought you were supposed to be and surrender to who you've always been, beneath the layers of conditioning, beneath the accumulation of others' expectations, beneath the carefully constructed identity that has kept you safe, acceptable, and fundamentally disconnected from your own aliveness. The archetype of awakening always demands sacrifice, not of external things, though those may follow, but of the false self that has served as your social passport, your psychological armor, your strategy for belonging in a world that rewards conformity over authenticity. It asks you to die before you die, to surrender the known self for the unknown self, to trade the security of your limitations for the terrifying freedom of your potential. I remember Maria, a woman who came to me after what she called 15 years of successful numbness. She had built what anyone would consider a perfect life: executive position at a prestigious firm, beautiful home in the right neighborhood, loving husband who adored her, 2 healthy children who excelled in school. On paper, she was winning at the game of life. In her body, she felt like she was suffocating. "I have everything I thought I wanted," she whispered during our first session, her voice carrying the weight of a confession she had never dared speak aloud. "I should be grateful. I should be happy, but I feel like I'm disappearing, like I'm becoming transparent even to myself. I look in the mirror and see a stranger wearing my face, living my life, making my choices. I feel like I'm watching my own existence from the outside, like I'm an actress who's forgotten she's playing a role." Her spiritual calling wasn't asking her to quit her job or abandon her family or dramatically restructure her external circumstances. It was asking her to stop abandoning herself. The rupture she was experiencing wasn't a breakdown. It was a breakthrough of her authentic nature demanding expression after years of systematic suppression. This is where we get confused about spiritual callings. We expect them to arrive with clarity, with inspiration, with a sense of divine purpose that lifts us above the mundane concerns of human existence. We think they should feel uplifting, empowering, filled with light and love and positive energy. But true spiritual callings often arrive disguised as restlessness, as a persistent sense that something is wrong, as what Jung called creative illness, a necessary disintegration that precedes integration. The calling doesn't usually announce itself with trumpets and celestial choirs. More often, it whispers through your chronic dissatisfaction with a life that looks successful but feels empty. It speaks through your inexplicable tears during movies that touch something you can't name. It manifests as insomnia that no sleep hygiene can cure, as anxiety that has no clear source, as depression that antidepressants can't touch because it's not a chemical imbalance, it's a soul imbalance. James Hillman, the archetypal psychologist who revolutionized our understanding of the soul's language, wrote about how the psyche creates symptoms to get our attention when we're living too far from our authentic nature. He called it the pathologizing tendency of the psyche, the soul's way of making us sick of our false life so we'll finally choose our true one. The false desire to be useful often becomes our most sophisticated refuge from this deeper transformation. We throw ourselves into helping others, saving the world, being the strong one everyone can count on, because it's easier than facing the vulnerable work of becoming who we really are. We become professional helpers, chronic caregivers, emotional first responders, anything to avoid the terrifying intimacy of our own inner landscape. But your soul didn't incarnate to be useful. It came to be authentic. And authenticity requires the courage to let your familiar self dissolve, to disappoint people who have invested in your false self, to stop being who others need you to be, and start being who you actually are. This dissolution feels like death, because in a very real sense, it is. The ego experiences authentic transformation as annihilation, which is why it resists so fiercely, why it creates elaborate strategies to keep you safely unconscious, why it would rather have you suffer in familiar ways than risk the unknown territory of genuine selfhood. There exists a particular suffering that belongs exclusively to those who have achieved everything they thought they wanted, who have checked every box on society's list of what constitutes a successful life, yet find themselves staring into an abyss of meaninglessness that no amount of accomplishment can fill. It's what I call the everything's fine outside syndrome. When your external life looks pristine, enviable, perfectly curated, but your internal landscape feels like a barren wasteland where nothing grows and nothing thrives. This is the hidden trauma of fullness. When you have everything you're supposed to want, the career, the relationship, the home, the financial security, the social status, but you feel empty inside, you begin to question your right to suffer at all. Society tells you to be grateful, to count your blessings, to stop complaining when others have so much less. But the soul doesn't speak the language of gratitude politics. It speaks the language of truth. And the truth is that you can have everything and still feel like you have nothing, because having is not the same as being. She had collected all the trophies: the corner office with the view, the devoted partner who brought her coffee in bed, the retirement savings that guaranteed security, the vacation photos that made her friends scroll with envy, the wardrobe that spoke of success, the social calendar filled with meaningful connections. But every morning she looked in the mirror and saw a stranger wearing her face, a person who had become expert at performing a life rather than living one. The emptiness wasn't ingratitude, it was intelligence. It was her psyche's way of saying, "This life we've constructed is too small for who you really are. We've built a beautiful cage, but it's still a cage." James Hillman wrote about this phenomenon, calling it the soul's refusal to be satisfied with a life that fits but doesn't fulfill, that succeeds by external measures but fails by internal ones. This is what happens when we achieve success by abandoning our soul, when we climb the ladder of achievement only to discover it was leaning against the wrong wall all along. We optimize our lives for efficiency, productivity, and social approval, but we forget to ask the deeper question: does this life allow my authentic self to breathe? Does this success serve my soul's agenda, or have I sacrificed my soul to serve success? The trauma of fullness is that it strips away our excuses. We can no longer blame our unhappiness on external circumstances, on lack of resources, on other people's behavior, on societal injustice. We're forced to confront the possibility that we've been complicit in our own emptiness, that we've systematically betrayed our authentic nature in service of an image, that we've traded our birthright of aliveness for a mess of pottage called having it all together. Maria Tatar, who studies fairy tales and their psychological significance, points out that many of the most powerful stories involve characters who must lose everything they think they want in order to find what they actually need. The trauma of fullness is often the beginning of this archetypal journey, the moment when the shiny external life reveals itself to be a golden prison, when success becomes a symptom of spiritual poverty. But here's what we rarely acknowledge: the symbolic rejection of our own greatness has become a chronic condition in our culture. We've learned to settle for lives that are good enough, relationships that are functional enough, careers that are stable enough, because we've forgotten that enough is the enemy of the soul. The soul doesn't want enough. It wants everything, not in terms of material accumulation, but in terms of authentic expression, genuine connection, meaningful contribution. The emptiness that success can't fill is actually a form of sacred hunger, a divine dissatisfaction that refuses to be appeased by anything less than the real thing. It's your soul's way of saying, "I didn't come here to play small, to hide my light under a bushel of respectability, to live a life that others would approve of but that I can barely tolerate." This recognition can be devastating because it calls into question everything you've worked for, everything you've built, everything you've identified as yourself. But it's also liberating because it means the emptiness isn't evidence that something is wrong with you. It's evidence that something is right with you. Your soul is functioning exactly as it should, refusing to be satisfied with counterfeit nourishment, holding out for the real sustenance of authentic living. Your nervous system was designed by millions of years of evolution to keep you alive, not to keep you authentic. And sometimes, Often, these two imperatives find themselves in direct, irreconcilable conflict. When your soul calls you toward transformation, toward the unknown territory of who you might become, your biology frequently responds as if you're under mortal threat, flooding your system with stress hormones that make change feel like death. Dr. Stephen Porges' groundbreaking polyvagal theory reveals the sophisticated ways our autonomic nervous system constantly scans our environment for safety or threat, making split-second decisions about how to respond before our conscious mind even registers what's happening. What feels like spiritual resistance, what seems like stubbornness or self-sabotage, might actually be existential cortisol, your ancient survival system hijacking your ability to hear the whispers of your deeper wisdom. But here's what the nervous system, in all its primitive intelligence, doesn't understand. Sometimes the greatest danger isn't change, it's staying the same. Sometimes the life you're trying so desperately to preserve, the identity you're clinging to with white knuckles, the routine that feels so safe and manageable, is the very thing that's slowly killing your spirit, suffocating your soul, turning you into a ghost of who you were meant to be. I think of David, a successful attorney who started having panic attacks every time he walked into his pristine office with its mahogany desk and prestigious law books and view of the city skyline. His body was staging a full-scale rebellion, screaming no to a life his rational mind had decided was logical, practical, secure. His heart would race, his palms would sweat, his chest would tighten with an unnamed terror that had nothing to do with courtrooms or clients and everything to do with the slow spiritual suffocation of spending his days in service to something that felt fundamentally foreign to his nature. For months, he treated the panic attacks as the problem, consulting cardiologists and psychiatrists, trying medications and breathing techniques, anything to quiet the messenger so he could continue ignoring the message. But his body's wisdom was older and deeper than his mind's logic. His nervous system was trying to save him from a life that looked successful but felt like death. Spiritual sensitivity requires embodied courage, not mystical escapism. It's not enough to receive intuitive guidance in meditation or prayer or quiet moments of reflection. You have to be brave enough to act on it, to let it restructure your actual life, to honor it, even when it calls you toward the unknown. This means learning to distinguish between the voice of fear, which keeps you small and safe and acceptable, and the voice of wisdom, which calls you forward into expansion even when the path is unclear, even when the destination is invisible. Your intuition isn't trying to make your life comfortable. It's trying to make your life authentic, and authenticity often requires walking away from everything that feels safe but no longer feels true, everything that provides security but prevents growth, everything that others would consider foolish to abandon, but that your soul knows you must release. The most spiritually sensitive people often have the most activated nervous systems. They feel everything more deeply, sense the subtle energies that others miss, pick up on the collective pain and joy and complexity of the world with an intensity that can feel overwhelming. But this sensitivity is not a weakness to be medicated or managed. It's a superpower that needs proper channeling, a gift that requires conscious cultivation. Clarissa Pinkola Estes writes about the wild woman archetype, the instinctual self that knows things the civilized mind has forgotten. This wild knowing doesn't speak in logical arguments or five-year plans. It speaks in gut feelings, in sudden knowing, in the body's yes and no responses that bypass rational analysis. But we've been taught to distrust this ancient wisdom, to override our instincts with our intellect, to value thinking over feeling, analysis over intuition. The fear of change isn't just psychological, it's neurobiological. Your brain is literally wired to perceive the unknown as dangerous, to prefer the familiar pain over unfamiliar pleasure, to choose the predictable suffering over unpredictable joy. But this same brain can be rewired through conscious practice, through gradually expanding your window of tolerance for uncertainty, through learning to distinguish between real danger and perceived threat. When you start honoring your intuitive guidance, when you begin to trust the intelligence of your deeper knowing, something remarkable happens. Your nervous system begins to recalibrate. What once felt terrifying starts to feel exciting. What once seemed impossible starts to seem inevitable. The very changes that once triggered panic attacks begin to feel like coming home to yourself. We are creatures of ritual, whether we realize it or not. Every morning routine, every habitual response, every unconscious pattern of behavior is a form of ceremonial activity that either awakens us to our aliveness or puts us to sleep in the comfortable coffin of the familiar. The question is not whether you engage in ritual. You do constantly, but whether your rituals serve your awakening or your avoidance. The archetype of the servant of order can become a prison for the soul when it takes over completely, when the part of us that finds comfort in repetition, in predictability, in the illusion of control, begins to dominate our existence so thoroughly that we lose touch with spontaneity, with mystery, with the essential wildness that keeps us alive to possibility. She had perfected the art of functional numbness, creating a daily routine so precisely calibrated that it eliminated any space for the unexpected, any opening for the soul to speak its truth. Coffee at exactly 6 a.m. while scrolling through emails that made her feel important but not alive. Emails until 7, responding to other people's urgencies while ignoring her own deepest needs. Gym until 8, mechanically going through the motions of self-care while remaining fundamentally disconnected from her body's wisdom. Work until 6 p.m., performing competence while her spirit slowly withered. Dinner, Netflix, sleep, repeat, repeat, repeat until the days blurred together into an endless loop of efficient emptiness. Each day was identical to the last, each week a carbon copy of the previous one, each month disappearing into the next without leaving any trace of genuine experience, any residue of real living. The soul was suffocating in the safety of sameness, dying of spiritual starvation while being fed a steady diet of routine productivity. The illusion of functioning well becomes a sophisticated pact with psychic stagnation. We mistake efficiency for effectiveness, busyness for aliveness, routine for ritual. But true ritual connects us to the sacred dimension of existence, opens us to mystery, creates space for transformation. False ritual, the kind that masquerades as self-care while actually serving avoidance, disconnects us from ourselves, closes us to wonder, creates the illusion of progress while keeping us stuck in spiritual amber. Self-sabotage often wears the mask of self-care, appearing as responsible choices while actually serving unconscious strategies to avoid the discomfort of authentic living. The extra glass of wine that promises relaxation but actually numbs your sensitivity to your own inner voice. The endless scrolling through social media that feels like connection but actually distracts you from the profound loneliness of living disconnected from yourself. The overcommitment to activities and relationships that keeps your calendar so full you never have time for the solitude where transformation happens. These aren't character flaws or moral failures. They're unconscious strategies developed by a psyche that knows at some level that once you start listening to your soul's guidance, everything will have to change. The resistance isn't trying to keep you stuck out of malice. It's trying to protect the life you've worked so hard to build, even if that life no longer fits who you're becoming, even if it's slowly killing your spirit. But what if your resistance isn't weakness? What if it's wisdom? What if part of you knows that authentic transformation is not a gentle, gradual process, but a complete metamorphosis that requires the death of the caterpillar to birth the butterfly? What if your unconscious self-sabotage is actually a sophisticated form of self-protection, buying you time until you're truly ready for the magnitude of change that awaits you? Marion Woodman, The the Jungian analyst who specialized in the relationship between body and soul, wrote extensively about how we create elaborate defenses against our own transformation. She observed that many of her clients weren't ready to face their authentic selves because they intuited, correctly, that meeting their true nature would require them to completely restructure their lives. The question isn't how to eliminate resistance, but how to work with it consciously, how to honor the part of you that needs safety and predictability while also honoring the part of you that needs growth and expansion and authentic expression. This requires a delicate dance between the forces of conservation and the forces of transformation, between the wisdom of the familiar and the call of the unknown. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to create structure that supports your awakening rather than preventing it. This might mean establishing morning rituals that connect you to your deeper nature rather than immediately plugging into the external world. It might mean creating evening practices that help you process the day's experiences rather than escaping into mindless entertainment. It might mean scheduling regular solitude, not as loneliness to be avoided, but as sacred space for communion with your authentic self. The goal isn't to eliminate all routine. Structure can be incredibly supportive of transformation when it's chosen consciously rather than adopted unconsciously. The goal is to distinguish between rituals that serve your awakening and habits that serve your avoidance, between patterns that open you to possibility and routines that close you to change. There exists an ancient pain that has no name in modern psychology, no diagnostic category in our clinical manuals, no pharmaceutical intervention in our medical arsenal, the pain of being exiled from yourself. It's the peculiar suffering of feeling like a stranger in your own life, of looking around at everything you've built, the relationships, the career, the home, the daily routines, and wondering with genuine bewilderment, how did I get here? And who is this person I've become? The inner exile archetype emerges when we've lived so long according to external expectations, social conditioning, and others' definitions of success that we've lost touch with our internal compass, with the still, small voice that knows our true direction. We become immigrants in our own existence, speaking a language that isn't our native tongue, following customs that feel foreign to our nature, performing a life that looks convincing from the outside but feels hollow from within. This exile doesn't happen overnight. It's not a dramatic departure, but a gradual emigration from authenticity, one small compromise at a time. First, we silence the voice that says, the job doesn't really fit our nature, telling ourselves to be practical, to be grateful for stable employment. Then we ignore the persistent feeling that our closest relationship lacks the depth our soul craves, convincing ourselves that companionship is enough, that we're asking too much of love. We push down the knowing that we're capable of more, worthy of better, called to something different, telling ourselves to be realistic, to stop dreaming, to grow up and accept the limitations of adult life. With each compromise, each silencing of our authentic voice, each choice to prioritize others' comfort over our own truth, we take another step away from ourselves until one day we wake up in a life that technically belongs to us, but feels like it was designed for someone else entirely. Marion Woodman, the Jungian analyst who spent her career exploring the relationship between body and soul, spoke eloquently about how we can become exiled from our own body, exiled from our own soul. The symptoms are unmistakable once you know how to recognize them. Chronic fatigue that rest doesn't heal because it's soul tiredness, not physical exhaustion. Depression that medication doesn't touch because it's not a chemical imbalance, but a natural response to living disconnected from your authentic nature. Anxiety that has no clear source because it arises from the existential terror of being lost to yourself. A persistent sense of homesickness for a place you've never been, because that place is who you really are. But what if this homesickness is actually your soul's GPS, trying to guide you back to yourself? What if these symptoms aren't evidence of pathology, but proof of your psyche's intelligence, its refusal to let you settle permanently in the foreign country of your false self? The sacred wanderer within knows the way home, but it speaks in a language the rational mind often doesn't understand. The language of symbols, of dreams, of sudden tears during movies, of inexplicable attractions to certain books, certain people, certain places that seem to call to something deep within you. It's the part of you that lights up when you hear a particular piece of music, that feels mysteriously drawn to learn a new language you have no practical use for, that finds itself fascinated by cultures you've never experienced but somehow recognize. I remember Elena, who came to therapy describing what she called living someone else's life. She had everything she thought she wanted: successful medical practice, loving husband, beautiful children, but felt like she was watching her existence from the outside, like an actress who had become so identified with her role that she'd forgotten her own identity. "I look at old photographs of myself," she told me, "and I can see the moment when I stopped being present in my own life. You can see it in my eyes. They become empty, performed, like I'm posing as myself rather than being myself. I became so good at being who everyone needed me to be that I lost track of who I actually am." Learning the language of the sacred wanderer requires a different kind of listening, not with your analytical mind, which wants to categorize and control, but with your whole being, with what the mystics call the heart's intelligence. It requires creating space for silence, for solitude, for the kind of emptiness that allows subtle voices to emerge from beneath the noise of your daily preoccupations. But perhaps most challenging of all, it requires the courage to disappoint people who have invested in your exile, who benefit from your disconnection from your authentic power, who prefer the manageable version of you to the wild, unpredictable, fully alive person you might become if you actually came home to yourself. The journey back from exile is not a return to who you once were. That person is gone, integrated into who you're becoming. It's a journey toward who you've always been, beneath the layers of conditioning, beneath the accumulation of others' expectations, beneath the protective personas you've developed to survive in a world that often punishes authenticity. When we refuse our authentic calling, when we systematically ignore the persistent whispers of our deeper nature, we don't simply remain neutral, we become someone else entirely. The psyche, in its infinite creativity and its drive toward wholeness, constructs elaborate personas to fill the void left by our abandoned true self. These aren't chosen consciously. They emerge as unconscious survival strategies, sophisticated psychological masks that allow us to function in the world while keeping our authentic nature safely hidden. Suddenly, without quite knowing how it happened, you become the spiritual one in your family, carrying everyone's hope for transcendence while secretly feeling like a fraud, or the strong one, expected to hold everyone together while your own foundation crumbles in private, or the successful one, performing achievement while feeling empty inside, or the savior, compulsively rescuing others from their pain to avoid facing your own darkness. These archetypal masks aren't evil. In fact, they often serve beautiful purposes and help many people. The tragedy is that they become prisons, elaborate costumes we can't take off, roles we play so convincingly that we forget their roles at all. Carl Jung called this phenomenon possession by an archetype. When we become identified with a role rather than expressing our authentic nature through it. I remember Sarah, who had been the successful daughter for so long that she had no idea who she was when the achievement stopped feeling meaningful, when the next promotion felt like a betrayal of her soul rather than a reward for her efforts. Every accolade felt empty. Every recognition felt like recognition of someone else, someone she was impersonating with increasing skill but decreasing satisfaction. She had become a master at being who others needed her to be, the daughter who made her parents proud, the employee who exceeded every expectation, the friend who always had her life together, but a complete stranger to who she actually was beneath the performance. The mask had grown so sophisticated, so convincing, so seemingly integral to her identity that removing it felt like death. When archetypes take control instead of serving the self, they create what Clarissa Pinkola Estes calls the too good daughter, the eternal mother, the wounded healer, patterns that protect us from our vulnerability while also protecting us from our power, that keep us safe from rejection while also keeping us safe from genuine intimacy, that earn us approval while costing us our authenticity. The spiritual persona is particularly seductive because it appears so evolved, so conscious, so aligned with higher purpose. But when spirituality becomes a performance rather than a practice, when enlightenment becomes an identity rather than an experience, when being awakened becomes another way of avoiding the messy, complicated, beautifully human work of actual awakening, we've simply created a more sophisticated prison. This spiritual persona often develops as a response to family or cultural trauma, becoming the light in a dark family system, the healer in a wounded community, the wise one who helps others find their path while remaining lost in their own life. But carrying the projection of others' spiritual hopes while denying your own shadow, your own confusion, your own very human needs for support and understanding creates a particular kind of exhaustion that no amount of meditation can heal. The helper persona is equally compelling and equally imprisoning. When your sense of worth becomes entirely dependent on being needed, on solving others' problems, on being the one everyone turns to in crisis, you create a life structure that requires other people to remain broken for you to feel valuable. This isn't conscious manipulation, it's an unconscious strategy for maintaining a sense of purpose and identity that has become entangled with others' dysfunction. But personas don't just affect how we relate to others, they fundamentally distort our relationship with ourselves. When you spend years performing strength, you lose touch with your own vulnerability. When you spend years being the spiritual one, you lose permission to be confused, to doubt, to struggle with very human problems. When you spend years being the successful one, you lose the right to fail, to experiment, to try things you're not immediately good at. The way out isn't to destroy these personas. They developed for good reasons and often contain genuine gifts and abilities that want to be expressed authentically. The path is to recognize them as tools rather than identities, to use them consciously rather than being used by them, to remember that you are the actor, not just the character, that you contain multitudes beyond any single archetypal expression. But this requires the most difficult spiritual practice of all, the willingness to disappoint people who have invested in your false self, the courage to let others see you as you truly are rather than as they need you to be, the strength to withdraw the projections you've been carrying and return them to their rightful owners. Your suffering is not random. It's not punishment from a cruel universe. It's not evidence of your weakness or failure. It's not proof that something is fundamentally wrong with you or your life. Your pain is a symbolic code, written in the ancient language of the soul, waiting to be deciphered and translated into wisdom, into direction, into the kind of understanding that transforms suffering from meaningless torture into meaningful initiation. James Hillman revolutionized depth psychology by suggesting that symptoms are not problems to be solved, but symbols to be understood, not diseases to be cured, but messages to be received with the same reverence we would bring to sacred texts. The soul, he argued, doesn't want to be healed in the way we typically understand healing, fixed, returned to some previous state of normalcy, made comfortable and functional. The soul wants to be seen, felt, honored, and integrated into our conscious awareness. Think of your emotional pain as a dream you're living while awake, a symbolic drama being enacted in the theater of your daily life. Every recurring anxiety, every persistent sadness, Every bout of rage or despair or inexplicable emptiness carries information about what wants to emerge in your existence, what's trying to be born, what aspects of your authentic nature are demanding attention. The key isn't to eliminate these feelings. Trying to get rid of symptoms often just drives them deeper underground, where they continue to influence your life from the shadows. The key is to decode their symbolic meaning, to ask not, "How can I make this stop, Wunmus?" but, "What is this trying to tell me? What wants to die so that something new can be born? What part of my authentic nature is this pain trying to protect or express?" The woman who felt suffocated in her marriage wasn't suffering from relationship dysfunction in any pathological sense. She was experiencing the archetypal death of the maiden, the necessary ending that precedes the birth of the sovereign woman. Her claustrophobia wasn't neurosis, it was transformation trying to happen, the psyche's way of communicating that she had outgrown the container of her current relational dynamic and needed space to discover who she was becoming. The man who couldn't commit to anything, not relationships, not career paths, not even vacation plans, wasn't commitment phobic in the clinical sense. He was the eternal adolescent refusing the death that comes with true adulthood, the letting go of infinite possibility for the sake of authentic choice. His inability to choose wasn't weakness. It was his soul's way of saying that none of the available options felt genuine to his nature, that he needed to discover who he truly was before he could commit to expressing that truth in the world. When we learn to read our symptoms symbolically, everything changes. Depression becomes the soul's demand for depth in a superficial world, a natural response to living, disconnected from what matters most. Anxiety becomes the call to expand beyond our comfort zone, the nervous system's way of signaling that we're ready for growth even if we don't feel ready. Emptiness becomes the space being cleared for something more authentic to emerge, the necessary void that precedes creation. But this symbolic reading requires a fundamental shift in how we relate to our pain. Instead of experiencing it as an enemy to be defeated, we learn to approach it as a teacher with something important to share. Instead of rushing to medicate it away or therapy it into submission, we create space to listen to its message, to receive its guidance, to honor its intelligence. This doesn't mean romanticizing suffering or avoiding necessary healing interventions. It means treating your pain as sacred information, as a letter from your future self, as guidance from the part of you that knows what your conscious mind has forgotten. The Sufi tradition speaks of holy suffering, the kind of pain that breaks us open to greater love, greater wisdom, greater capacity for authentic living. This is different from neurotic suffering, which keeps us stuck in repetitive patterns that serve no growth. Holy suffering has direction, purpose, intelligence. It's moving us towards something, even when we can't see the destination. Rumi understood this when he wrote about being broken open by love, about how our wounds become the places where light enters. But we've forgotten how to distinguish between suffering that serves and suffering that merely repeats, between pain that initiates and pain that imprisons. The integration process isn't about eliminating the symbol, it's about understanding what it represents and then living that understanding. When the woman realized her claustrophobia was her sovereign self-demanding space to emerge, she didn't need to leave her marriage. She needed to renegotiate it from her authentic power rather than her adaptive compliance. When the man understood his commitment issues as his soul's refusal to settle for inauthentic choices, he didn't need to force himself to commit. He needed to discover what was genuinely worth committing to. Sometimes the integration requires external changes, leaving relationships that can't accommodate your authentic self, changing careers that stifle your soul's expression, moving to places that better support who you're becoming. But more often, the transformation is internal, a shift in how you inhabit your existing life, how you show up in your current relationships, how you express your truth within your present circumstances. The pain ceases not because the external situation changes, but because you're no longer at war with yourself. You've stopped trying to force your soul into containers that don't fit. You've learned to honor the symbolic wisdom of your symptoms instead of viewing them as evidence of your brokenness. The most radical spiritual practice isn't meditation or prayer or any of the techniques we typically associate with enlightenment. It's inhabiting your body with presence, reverence, and conscious awareness. In a culture that teaches us to live from the neck up, to privilege thought over feeling, mind over matter, intellect over intuition, returning to embodied awareness is an act of profound rebellion against the forces that keep us disconnected from our authentic power. Your body is not just the vehicle for your soul, it is the sacred temple where your soul meets matter, where spirit learns to dance with form, where the infinite expresses itself through the finite. Every sensation, every impulse, every physical response carries information about your authentic nature that your mind alone cannot access, wisdom that your rational intelligence cannot compute. But embodiment isn't just about feeling good in your skin or maintaining physical health, though these are beautiful byproducts. It's about learning to trust the intelligence that moves through your flesh, the ancient knowing that predates language, the somatic wisdom that can sense what your mind cannot see, feel what your heart cannot yet name, know what your ego doesn't want to acknowledge. The polyvagal theory, developed by Dr. Stephen Porges, reveals that our nervous system is constantly scanning our environment for safety or threat, making sophisticated decisions about how to respond before our conscious mind even registers what's happening. When we learn to attune to these subtle bodily responses, the slight tightening in our chest when someone lies to us, the expansion in our heart when we encounter genuine love, the contraction in our gut when we're considering a choice that betrays our nature, we gain access to a form of wisdom that transcends rational analysis. I think of Elena, who had been making decisions from her head for so long that she had completely forgotten what her body's yes and no felt like. We spent months just learning to notice. What happens in your chest when you think about that job opportunity? How does your breathing change when you're with that person? What does your gut tell you about this relationship? What happens in your shoulders when you consider moving to that city? Gradually, she began to recognize that her body had been trying to communicate with her all along. The tension headaches that appeared whenever she thought about her current career weren't random. They were her nervous system's way of saying, "This path is not aligned with your nature." The way her heart rate increased around certain people wasn't anxiety. It was her somatic intelligence detecting energy that didn't feel safe or nourishing. Somatic listening becomes a bridge between spirit and flesh, between the ethereal insights of spiritual practice and the practical reality of making choices that honor your authentic nature. It's how we learn to embody our spiritual understanding rather than just thinking about it, how we integrate transcendent experiences into immanent living. This is why so many spiritual seekers feel disconnected despite years of practice. They've developed their capacity for transcendence while neglecting their capacity for immanence, their ability to find the sacred within the ordinary, the divine within the human, the eternal within the temporal. They can access altered states of consciousness but struggle to access their own authentic feelings. They can channel cosmic wisdom but can't feel their own boundaries. True spiritual maturity isn't about escaping the body. It's about descending fully into it, discovering that matter itself is sacred, that flesh itself is a form of prayer, that every breath is a conversation with the divine. The mystics knew this. Rumi wrote about the body as a guest house, where every emotion is a visitor to be welcomed. Hildegard of Bingen spoke of the body as a manifestation of divine creativity. The tantric traditions recognize the body as the temple where human and divine unite. But returning to the body requires courage, because the body holds not just pleasure and wisdom, it also holds all the pain, trauma, and fear we've been avoiding through mental spiritual bypassing. When we drop from our heads into our hearts, from our thoughts into our feelings, from our concepts into our direct experience, we often encounter everything we've been trying to transcend. This is why embodied spirituality is so challenging and so transformative. It asks us to be present to our full human experience, the joy and the sorrow, the clarity and the confusion, the love and the fear. It invites us to find the sacred not despite our humanity, but through it, not by transcending our limitations, but by embracing them as part of the divine expression. The practice begins simply, placing your hand on your heart and asking, "What do you need me to know right now?" Breathing into your belly and noticing what wants to move, what wants to be expressed. Standing in front of the mirror and looking into your own eyes with the same love you would offer a beloved child. Walking in nature and letting your body remember its connection to the earth that made it. These aren't just self-care practices. They're acts of spiritual rebellion against a culture that profits from your disconnection from your own wisdom, your own power, your own capacity to know what's true for you without needing external validation or permission. Let me tell you about the moment everything changed for Rebecca. She had been living with chronic anxiety for 15 years, treating it as an enemy to be defeated, a weakness to be overcome, a problem to be solved through therapy and medication and every healing modality she could find. She had become a professional patient, organizing her entire life around managing her symptoms, defining herself by her diagnosis, relating to her inner experience as pathology rather than potential. One morning, after another sleepless night of racing thoughts and chest tightness, instead of reaching automatically for her anxiety medication or calling her therapist or launching into her usual mental strategies for calming down, she did something different. She sat with the sensation and asked it a question she had never thought to ask. "What are you trying to protect me from? What are you trying to tell me?" The answer didn't come in words, but in images, in body memories, in a sudden understanding that flooded through her, like recognition of something she had always known but never acknowledged. She saw herself as a little girl, hiding in a closet during her parents' violent fights, making herself as small and invisible as possible to stay safe. She felt in her body the adaptive strategy she had developed. If I don't take up too much space, if I don't shine too brightly, if I don't ask for what I need, maybe I won't be hurt. The anxiety wasn't trying to torture her. It was trying to keep her small enough to stay safe. It had been her nervous system's way of saying, don't expand, don't risk, don't become too visible, because visibility equals danger. But what had once been protection had become a prison. Safety had become a cage. That day she made a different choice. Instead of shrinking from her anxiety, she thanked it for its faithful service, for trying to keep her safe all these years, and gently invited it to witness her stepping into the woman she was always meant to be. She didn't try to eliminate the anxiety. She tried to understand its symbolic message and then live that understanding. The anxiety didn't disappear overnight, but it transformed from a prison into a guide, from a limitation into a compass, pointing toward her authentic power. When the familiar tightness appeared in her chest, instead of interpreting it as evidence of her brokenness, she learned to ask, where am I betraying myself right now? Where am I making myself small to make others comfortable? What truth am I avoiding? Gradually, she began to recognize that her most intense anxiety often preceded her most important growth. It appeared when she was about to make a choice that honored her authentic nature rather than her adapted self, when she was about to speak a truth that needed to be spoken, when she was about to claim space that belonged to her by birthright. This is what happens when we stop running from our pain and start listening to its wisdom. The symptoms don't always disappear. Sometimes the most profound healing is learning to dance with our shadows rather than eliminating them, learning to work with our sensitivity rather than trying to numb it, learning to honor our complexity rather than trying to simplify it away. Your spiritual calling isn't something you have to find. It's something you have to stop avoiding. It's been calling your name in the language of your deepest longings, your persistent dissatisfactions, your middle-of-the-night awakenings, your tears that come from nowhere and everywhere at once, your inexplicable homesickness for a life you've never lived but somehow remember. The path forward isn't about fixing yourself. You were never broken in the first place. You are not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. Not a diagnosis to be managed, but a soul to be expressed. Not a collection of symptoms, but a unique manifestation of divine creativity, learning to know itself through human experience. It's about remembering yourself, coming home to the person you were before the world told you who you should be, before you learned to abandon your authentic nature in service of safety, acceptance, and approval. It's about recognizing that your sensitivity is not weakness but wisdom, that your depth is not dysfunction but gift, that your refusal to settle for superficial satisfaction is not dissatisfaction but discrimination. The journey requires courage, not the kind of courage that charges into battle, but the quiet courage that sits still long enough to hear what the silence is trying to say. It's the courage to disappoint people who have invested in your false self, to withdraw projections you've been carrying that were never yours to carry, to stop being who others need you to be and start being who you actually are. Tonight, before you sleep, place your hand on your heart and ask your body, what have I been avoiding that wants to be born? What truth have I been protecting others from by keeping it hidden from myself? What aspect of my authentic nature is ready to emerge? Don't expect an answer in words. Listen for the stirring, the warmth, the gentle pull towards something you can't yet name, but somehow recognize. Your pain has been faithful to you when nothing else was. It has been the guardian of your authentic self, refusing to let you settle permanently in the foreign country of your false life, refusing to let you forget that you're capable of more, worthy of better, called to something that honors the magnitude of who you really are. Your symptoms have been love letters from your soul, written in the only language loud enough to pierce through the noise of your conditioned mind, persistent enough to get your attention despite all your strategies for avoiding them, intelligent enough to guide you toward what wants to emerge in your life. The resistance you've felt toward change hasn't been weakness. It's been wisdom. The part of you that knows authentic transformation is not a gentle self-improvement project, but a complete metamorphosis that requires the death of who you thought you were for the birth of who you actually are. But now the time for avoidance is ending. The calling is becoming too loud to ignore, the pain too intelligent to medicate away, the gap between your authentic nature and your performed life too wide to bridge with compromise and rationalization. It wasn't pain, it was a calling, but I needed silence to finally hear it. The silence is here now. It is in this moment, beneath the noise of your thoughts, beneath the chatter of your mental commentary, beneath the urgency of your daily concerns, there is a profound silence where your true self waits with infinite patience for you to remember who you've always been. The calling is here now. Not as a career change or a life mission or a 5-year plan, but as an invitation to inhabit your own existence with presence, authenticity, and reverence for the sacred nature of your individual expression of the divine mystery. Your authentic self is here now, waiting not in some future moment when you've healed enough or grown enough or become enough, but in this breath, in this heartbeat, in this exact moment of recognition that you are not here to be perfect but to be real, not here to transcend your humanity but to express it fully. The question isn't whether you're worthy of this transformation. You are by virtue of being alive, by virtue of having a soul that refuses to settle for less than authentic expression. The question isn't whether you're ready. You wouldn't be hearing this if some part of you wasn't prepared for what's being offered. The question is simply this: are you willing to stop being who you think you should be and start being who you actually are? Are you willing to trust that your authentic self is not something you need to create, but something you need to stop hiding? Are you willing to believe that your pain has been intelligent, your resistance has been protective, and your calling has been faithful even when you haven't been listening? Your soul has been waiting your entire life for you to ask these questions. And now finally you have. The journey home to yourself begins with this recognition, continues with each choice to honor your authentic nature over your adapted self, and culminates not in some future moment of enlightenment, but in the daily practice of being courageously, vulnerably, unapologetically yourself. The pain that brought you here was never your enemy. It was your soul's way of saying, you are capable of more than this. You deserve better than this. You are called to something that honors the fullness of who you are, and it will continue to speak until you listen, continue to call until you answer, continue to love you enough to refuse to let you settle for a life that fits but doesn't fulfill. Welcome home to yourself. The journey of authentic living begins now. If something in this message stirred recognition in your soul, trust that resonance. Your authentic self is recognizing its own truth reflected back to you. This isn't coincidence. It's your inner wisdom confirming what it has always known. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more conversations that honor the sacred complexity of becoming who you really are. Remember, you are not here to be perfect. You are here to be real, and real includes all of it: the light and the shadow, the clarity and the confusion, the strength and the vulnerability. This is not a path to perfection, it's a path to wholeness. Your calling isn't asking you to become someone else. It's asking you to stop pretending to be someone else and start being who you've always been, beneath the masks, beneath the roles, beneath the fear of your own magnificent authenticity.